Hello, one and all, and welcome to an episode of Top Deck Thoughts. Now, the reason why my voice is a little bit down at the moment, I will try to up it a bit, but some people are sleeping at the moment, so I did want to get this spoiler day 2 video out though, so I am going to explain my 2 cents over the cards. There's actually some pretty saucy ones that came out, so we're just going to go straight into it. Let's first talk about this Moto card that we got, which is a Mythic, which is technically Amelia's Call. So, what happens is it's a sorcery spell that costs 7 mana, very pricey, but you do get the ability to create 2 4/4 White Angel Warrior creature tokens with flying, so it helps you with the party mechanic, which is nice. Oh, and by the way, also non-angel creatures you control gain indestructible until on a turn, so a very nice 7-cost spell. But you also have the ability to play it as a land, which, as we've been seeing, a majority of the time it's tap lands, but for Mythic, they actually decided to do something a little special. These ones can actually come in untap. As this enters the battlefield, you may pay for your life. If you don't, it enters the battlefield tap. So it's kind of like a bolt, monocolored bolt land, I guess is the best way to phrase it. So, I do think this card is good, but I do think people are going to be very overhyping of this. I've been more thinking about this, and we are seeing a lot of these cards that are the choice of, hey, you either get the choice of it being a land or a spell. And I think many people are kind of thinking worst case mentality, where it's like, oh no, everybody's going to replace the lands in their deck with these cards because they can be lands even though they enter in tap. The modularity of it is very powerful and it's going to break all of Magic. Oh no. Honestly, I think it's not. I think these are going to be powerful, and like I said before, there is definitely a volatile nature to the cards. But I do think this is a card that people are overhyping a teeny little bit. It's still good. I do think a control shell will play this because, at worst, you can play it on turn 1 if you need to as a land, while later down on the line you can play it as a 7-mana sorcery spell. But one thing I will pretty much catch on with this, there is the factor that this is a non-basic land. All this cycle are non-basic lands. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because Field of Ruin is still a card in Standard. And Field of Ruin is probably going to be a lot more playable card when this set comes out. Because the factor is, a lot of people are going to be playing this new gimmick of lands. It's kind of cool. It has these flashy little effects. It's modular. It helps you with your land fixing. Perfectly great cards. But the problem is, you can Field of Ruin, and if you decide to try to go Timmy with it and be like, oh, I'm going to fill all my deck with these modular land cards that are just essentially a spell and a land side, you're going to feel really bad when you get Field of Ruin and you can't fetch for a basic. That's all I'm saying there. Plus, also, there's the aspect that we still have powerful lands in the set, aka in Standard, aka the Castle Cycle, and the Castle Cycle does matter with specific land types. Now, if you do want to try to go approach this type of deck design and still want to keep castles within your design, I do think you do have to go into green so you can play Dryad and such, or even that new 5-cost Elemental Mythic, but we'll get to that one shortly. Nevertheless, I do think these cards are good. It's a very powerful land, and if it's become a cycle, then it'll be very powerful. But I don't think it's going to be an automatic, everybody has to get like 4 of these cards and such. At most, I think people should only play 2 and still make sure they play their powerful lands and basics. In my honest opinion. I do think they're still powerful, and they're definitely something to keep an eye on, but I do think they're being a teeny bit overhyped, this potential mythic cycle. But nevertheless, moving on, there is one spell that I'm actually really excited about, which is Soul Shatter. 2 and a black with some gorgeous, forgive me if I butcher this name, but Weil Beckett art. Weil Beckett art. I actually seen this artist work before in the showcase cards of pretty much Eldraine, but it's an instant spell that each opponent, so this doesn't affect you whatsoever, each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker with the highest converted mana cost among creatures and planeswalkers they control. This is a really good, powerful card. Like, the factor is, a lot of times that one of the black's main weakness is they really have a hard time dealing with hexproof spells. Like, we're talking about a Dream Trolls in the world, or the cards that pretty much can give a creature hexproof and such, like they do, like a cheap combat trick or something like that. Well, Soul Shadow doesn't really kill. It doesn't target, the opponent has to choose, and they are forced to choose, what most likely is going to be the biggest threat on the board, whether it's a planeswalker or a creature. So I can actually see this actually have a potential to see a lot of play. It's definitely good as a 2 of in mono black control. You could even see play in multicolor control decks. It's really good, don't sleep on it. And that's up one of my favorite arts of the set, Tangled Florahedron. Actually, I'm going to look at this closer and such, but seriously, that art is so cute. It's a 2 green 1/1 elemental, but it's a mana dork. And also, you can flip it and have a choice of either let it enter in as a land that enters the battlefield tap. Now, overall, I think this is a cute card. I do think it does have a chance to see play because it's still, at the worst, it's a 2 mana dork, and people play the mana dorks when they need to. That, at the worst, can then become a land. So, you either play it as a land early, or you play it as a turn 2 mana dork. Perfectly functional, plus it's also an elemental, so elemental tribal synergies is something to keep in mind. Oh yeah, and before we go to this, back to this and this, with this whole land cycle and Field of Ruin, why do I think Field of Ruin is going to see a lot of play? It's because of these cycles. Plus, also, Field of Ruin helps trigger landfall. That was one thing I wanted to make sure I keep a mental note of, so yeah, keep that in mind. Nevertheless, we're actually going to go to Coralhelm Chronicler, 2 and a blue for a Merfolk Wizard, 2/2. Whenever you cast a kick spell, so it doesn't have to be kicked, keep that in mind, draw a card, then discard a card. And then when this enters the battlefield, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a card with kicker ability from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Honestly, I think this is a perfectly fine creature. If you just consider it a 2-drop, that's a 2 mana, and then your 1 mana essentially anticipating more or less for a specific card type. I think it's perfectly fine. I don't know if it's competitive per se, but it's definitely, if you are going to try to make the kicker wizard deck, this is definitely a nice tool for that deck. Though I will say that deck is also trying to find a combination of making spells and wizards, so there might be chances where you don't actually pick up a kick spell and just pick up a wizard on accident, and then you don't pick up anything, so that's a little awkward. Nevertheless, though, I do think it's a card that does have potential. It's also a Merfolk. I don't know if that matters. I don't know if there's any Merfolk kicker decks in Modern or such, but it's a fun food for thought at the very least. Next up, a tech card that I think we would have liked a few months ago. Roiling Vortex, 1 and a red for an enchantment that has, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, it deals 1 damage to them. Okay, so during your turn and each of your opponent's turn, they're going to get dealt a point of damage. And also can be modifiable with other enchantments, but we'll get to that in a minute. However, whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast a spell, Roiling Vortex deals 5 damage to that player. So, for example, in EDH, if someone decides to cast a Mana Crypt, they spend 0 mana on that spell, they're going to get 5 damage. Boop. Like that. And it also has an activated ability of 1 red mana. Your opponents can't gain life this turn. Honestly, perfectly fine tech card. I think it's one of those cards where I think burn decks, at least in standard, will definitely consider it. So, mostly just for the fact that you get incremental points of damage, and there are ways in standard to actually modify this damage. We do have stuff like Torbrand. We do also have stuff like Fiery Emancipation. I'm almost kind of contemplating on making a Jeskai deck where it's essentially Dance of the Mance, and you Dance of the Mance a bunch of Rolling Vortexes and a Fiery Emancipation just to deal a significant amount of burn damage. That's definitely going to be one of the more jinkier decks I might try out, actually, now coming to think of it. Now, for the second part of this text, whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to it, this is a card that, as I jokingly said, would have been nice a few months ago, since Fires of Invention was a very, very popular card, as people can remember. But Fires of Invention got banned, so that second card pot is nothing to sneeze at, especially for EDH shenanigans. But I do think, with the exception of a very few set of cards, like, I can only think of, like, stuff like Vadrock and even just, like, a few little fringe spells that allows you to cast a spell for free, essentially. I think the second part of this text is not going to be used a majority of the time, but when it does, it's actually kind of cool. I mean, I think one way you could actually use this, which is kind of cute, is if you do, like, you play this and then, like, you play the Oh, I'm having a brain fart on it. It was from Pharaohs. It was the one with the really good set mechanic art where you essentially draw a bunch of cards, semi-draw cards, essentially, reveal the cards from the top, and then your opponent casts one of the cards for free that they can have a choice. Well, if it's a forced cast, then technically, then they will cast it for free because that's their option. But in exchange, they have to get dealt 5 damage. So, just a food for thought regarding to the jankier application with this card. And then the last part is probably going to be where it's going to be used the majority of the time, the activate ability of red, where your opponents can't gain life this turn. Obviously, this is a tech against life gain matter decks, which honestly I think is going to be a very powerful archetype post-rotation. So the fact that we have this as a nice tech card against the life gain decks, very nice. Overall, I think it's a great card. I do think this is a card to not sleep on. I think it's pretty good for both jankier applications, but at the worst, it's just a really decent tech card. Next up, it is the power of. Okay, this is one reason why I like Scryfall, is because when they do these translations, they always do kind of like joking translations. So, the power of friendship. 1 white for an instant spell, choose target attacking or blocking creature. The power of friendship deals damage to creature equal to twice the number of creatures in your party. I think this is fine for limited. I'm not sure for standard. I mean, the thing is, you do have to at least have one creature on the battlefield to even use this card, and it has to be in the party consistency. So if you do that, then it's just a 1 mana deal 2 damage to a target attacking or blocking creature, which we have those spells in the past. Not that great. However, if you do kind of go full on into the party, then this card is maybe something to consider, at least as a 1 or 2 of, because then let's say you're able to get a full party, a 1 mana deal 8 damage to a target attacking or blocking creature, that's nothing to sneeze at. But like I said, I'm looking at this from an incremental perspective, and at its worst, it's dealing 0 damage, which that is really, really bad. Because remember, an opponent can, when you have the spell in the stack, remove maybe your one creature that's part of your party, and then this deals 0 damage and you feel really sad. But if there's a way you can keep your party protected and such, maybe give them hexproof of some sort, or maybe there's a hexproof creature that can be part of your party and such, so then it makes it hard to target, then I say this is something to consider. But I would never go like full frenzy on it and play it like a playset. This is more like a 1 or 2 of, if I'm being legit honest. Next up, we go to one of the uncommon land cycles, which is a sorcery spell. And really disturbing art, in my personal opinion. Like, okay, context. I am a little squeamish around mosquitoes, so this art does legit creep me out a little bit. But nevertheless, it's Slip. Seriously, Scryfall. Slip, Gulp. A 6 mana sorcery spell that has each opponent loses 5 life, you gain 5 life. Honestly, if we're talking about the sorcery spell portion, not that great. Maybe in a veto deck, you might give it a shot in the fact that you can play it also as a land, potentially, if you have to play it as a land early game. And of course, the land portion of it is the swamp, which then enters the battlefield tap. It's still a non-basic land type, so it's just a land, enters the tap, and you can tap it for black mana. Honestly, this is probably one of the cycles that I'm not impressed by. This is the one card that I'm not really impressed by. I think it's fine, especially the factor is if you are in a veto deck, that incremental, this could be used as a finisher to an extent that, at worst, if you have to play it as a land early, perfectly fine. But it's more going to be in the mono black life gain decks. I don't think you really want to play this tap land in an Orzhov life gain deck. Even with the factor that you can later down the line in the game play the Slip Gulp spell and then maybe be a finisher. I think there are better finishers in the life gain deck personally, but who knows? Maybe this is more applicable for limited and sealed, if I'm being honest. Plus, also landfall triggers, so yeah. One card that I am kind of impressed by is actually Strike the Gaming Weirdest. It's a red instant spell that also has the module ability that it can be a land. The land part of it enters the battlefield tap, but the instant part of it can deal 1 damage to any target, so this can hit the face. And if a permanent dealt damage this way would die this turn, exile it instead. Okay, first of all, that art is also kind of legitimately creepy too, because nobody really wants. That just reminds me of kind of like those Survivor films where somebody has to like remove a barbed wire or barbed stick out of their. Ugh. Anyway, I'll just go down to the card description here. Overall, I think the card's pretty good. I do think the factor that this helps negate against Uro type shenanigans or any of the elder giants and such that we got from the Pharaoh's block is actually a nice touch here. So if someone play a Krotza, all you have to do is deal 1 point of damage to it and it exiles itself. Really nice. Plus the fact that it also does the same thing to Uro, very nice as well. Now, it's going to be interesting to see if people will try to mainboard this in mono red aggro. I could definitely see an argument for it since it can just replace a mountain slot in there, but like I said, don't go crazy and throw all these type of modular cards as your lands. Like, maybe you take out 2 to 3 mountains to replace this, then you'll be perfectly fine, especially if someone tries to Field of Ruin you, and then you just essentially, then you can just get one of your mountain basics and such, so you'll be fine. But I still think this is a pretty good card. It's actually a lot more better for mono burn than you would take at first glance, especially in the current standard where we have the Uros of the world and the Krotzas, and other creatures that we would not really appreciate if the opponent has methods of reanimation, let's just say. So definitely keep an eye on this. Next up, we have the Maul. I think Maze, but technically it's a Maul. Maul of the Skyclaves. 2 and a white for an artifact equipment. When it enters the battlefield, attach it to target creature you control. And an equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has flying and first strike. Well, if you want a good turn for your equipment that you can turn for Nahiri with, here you go. Plus, also, what's really nice about this card is the factor that if you have a creature on the battlefield, you can just cast this and put it on the creature, which is pretty silly. Like, you could say, let's say you put this on a turn 2 menace creature, and then you just play this on turn 3, then you have both a menace, first strike, flying creature. That's ridiculously absurd. So, with this card, I definitely would say keep an eye on the 2 drops that are in your deck design, because if you plan accordingly, you can do some absurd plays like playing a very powerful 2-drop creature, which then gets the Maul, and then essentially becomes a lot more absurd kind of free drop. And if the creature dies, while the equip cost is costly, there are ways around it, such as stuff with like combat tricks we're going to talk about soon, as well as with Nahiri and such. So I say this card is really good. I do say you want to keep your eye on it because I do think this is a very powerful aura equipment kind of scenario. And it is one of those equipments that I wanted to see, so we're probably going to have some equipment shenanigans, that's all I'm saying. Next up, Umar Mystic. 1 in Izzet for a Merfolk Wizard, 1 free, flying. Whenever you cast an instant, sorcery, or wizard spell, Umar Mystic gets +2 until end of turn. So, kind of our fairy wizards of the set, essentially. Perfectly fine card, actually. Good and limited. It'll be interesting to see if it has some construct applications, but I think it's going to be a really good limited card because the factor it is in limited, you can get the multiple wizards and the instant sorcery spells to do that, so it kind of can synergize with a blue-red wizards deck. And it's definitely a card to consider for constructed as well, because then this also gets the buff when you cast your wizard spells, which you want to cast, so it's definitely a food for thought for constructed. I do think there are still better free drops, but this is not a bad free drop. I will not deny that. This is not bad. Plus, the art is gorgeous, so definitely keep an eye on it. I think it's decent, but I don't think it's like amazing. Next up, we have a legendary creature, a free drop legendary creature, Demon Cleric. Yes. Tabarat's Hope's Demise. Hope's Demise. 2 and a black for a 2/2 with flying. It has lifelink as long as it has 5 or more +1/+1 counters on it. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, put a +1/+1 counter on Tabarat's. If a creature was a cleric, you may draw a card. If you do, you lose 1 life. I actually legit like this card a lot. Because at the worst, it's a Windrake, and Windrakes are perfectly fine. And if you have a deck where you are going to sacrifice stuff consistently, this can become a significantly big threat that the opponent might need to be forced to remove really, really quick. Now, keep in mind, this can die to stuff like Eliminate and such in the format, so you do have to keep that in mind, but the fact that it can get counters on it does make it potentially protect against Heartless Act type shenanigans, so that's really nice. Also, I do think this is the card that if you want to try to make oh, what's the name of that one cost artifact? I tried to play it with so much. The Ozolith, yes. If you want to try to do like a absent counters deck with the Ozolith and such, and you want a good payoff to throw all those counters on, well, a free mana 2/2 demon that when you throw all those counters on it can become a creature with lifelink and still has flying, plus maybe the additional ability counters that you got from your other creatures, that's not bad. I'm going to say that. That's actually really, really good. Plus, we have stuff like Woe Strider in the format that can still be unconditional sack outlets, so yeah, I do like this card. I don't think it's going to be competitive per se, but I do think there's some definitely janky stuff you can do with like the Ozlin and such. And then Commander, let's be honest, somebody's just going to do the brain fart Shadowborn Apostle deck with this card, and then just essentially just put a bunch of Shadowborn Apostles, and then sacrifice all of them to get this +7/+7 counters and get lifelink and such. So, pretty good. Pretty good. Next up, Expedition Skulker. Pretty fine, just a limited card. A 2 mana 2-drop that's a Vampire Rogue. If you have another Rogue, it gets Death Touch. Not bad. Not great, though. Dauntless Survivor. 1 in a green for a Human Warrior. When it enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Yet again, perfectly fine card, but I don't think it's like amazing. It's a good limited card. If you do need a warrior within your deck design, if you're trying to go with the party-based mechanic and constructed, it's there. I wouldn't recommend it, but it's there. I think this is more if you're doing like maybe party-based shenanigans and counter matter shenanigans, then this card becomes a little bit more considerate, let's just say. But honestly, no. Now, on the other hand, one card that did kind of tilt everybody's head sideways, even tilt mine, I was like, wait, this is a card? Nighthawk Scavenger. 1 black and a black for a creature vampire rogue. That is a 1+ star and free. Flying, Death Touch, Lifelink. It has Nighthawk Scavenger's power is equal to 1 plus the number of card types among cards in your opponent's graveyard. So, everybody is obviously making a comparison that this is Vampire Nighthawk and also Tremorgoyf kind of combined together into a pretty good card. Now, Uro's still in the format, so this could be kind of hit against the Uro shenanigans, like people, and also Scavenging Ooze. I think people are forgetting Scavenging Ooze. They all go to the Uro argument of why this card is not amazing, but I think people are forgetting that Scavenging Ooze is a card plus other graveyard hate shenanigans. That being said, on its basis alone, without the second part of this text, a free mana 1 free flying Death Touch lifelink, that's perfectly fine, if we're being honest. Like, being able to incrementally deal 1 point of damage and the opponent either has to force a block with their flying creature, which then the Death Touch will kill it. Yeah, and then it will still get the buff. Yeah, I think this card's actually really, really good. I think it will see a lot of play, especially in the blue-black kind of like rogues deck that people have been trying to do. It's a nice free drop for that deck, so especially since you're going to mill cards in your opponent's library anyway, so this can get big relatively quick is all I'm going to say. So yeah, keep an eye on this. I think this is really, really good. Next up, another good card, Swarm Chambler, a 1 green for a fungus beast. Let's actually take a closer look at the art here. And it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter, so it's going to be a 1 mana 1/1 with a counter on it. And then whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it becomes the target of a spell an opponent controls. So keep in mind, opponent controls, so you can't be cute and actually use pump spells to activate this ability. Keep that in mind. But if you do, you create a 1/1 green insect creature token. So that's pretty cool. And then you have an activated ability of 1 and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on itself. I think in the counter stack, this is going to be a good 1-drop. It's definitely going to not be a good replacement for stuff like, say, Pelt Collector, but I do think it's perfectly fine. It's a good 1-drop. It does get the counter synergies going, with also the factor that it helps protect your other creatures with counters on them, like people will play Stone Coil Serpent, and then if Stone Coil Serpent gets removed, the factor that they at least can redeem a 1/1 green creature insect token. Really great. I do think this is just a good kind of like insurance card for the counter stack if they need it. So kind of like a second Not as great heroic intervention, but still a semi-heroic intervention card where it gives you at least an insurance for your creatures with counters on them. Now keep in mind, targeted spells only. So if the opponent board wipes you, then you're kind of out of luck. So that's why I'm not like totally hyped about this card. That being said, though, it is still a good card, so I'm not going to sleep on it. This card is actually pretty good. Plus, if you also have Conclave Mentor on the battlefield, this can be a 1 mana 2/2, and as we stated before, 1 mana 2/2s are pretty strong, so keep that in mind. Next up, Fort the Grave. 4 mana and 2 black for a sorcery spell. It also has the party mechanic that this will cost 1 less for each creature in your party. So, in other words, if you have a full party, this will cost 2 mana. But what do? Well, you return target creature card and up to 1 target cleric, rogue, warrior, or wizard creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Okay, first of all, the art is gorgeous. Second of all, this card is really, really good. I think many people are kind of underestimating that and not realizing that this is a 6 mana return 2 creatures. And if you are doing the party based mechanic, which you're probably going to be doing with this card to actually get the effect of the discount, if you do that, then this can be discounted pretty quick. On its base, even if you don't have any party members at all due to a board wipe or such, playing this for 6 mana, I would not mind, because the fact that I can return any target creature, either a significant threat or anything to help build up the party, that's good. And then I could just return another creature card that is a party member and such, so I could return a warrior or a cleric or a rogue and a wizard, etc., and help fulfill the party-based mechanics. Granted, Graveyard Hate's still a thing. We still have Scavenging Ooze. We have other cards that could make this card a lot more problematic to actually play, but I do think the card actually has a lot of potential. I like it a lot. It's definitely one I'm going to keep my eye on. I actually like playing this card, potentially. I can see myself playing with this card a lot, especially if I do kind of like a party deck that has some black in it. I'm just going to say that. Like the card a lot, adore the art. I do actually adore this card a lot. Going from a card I adore to a card that I'm kind of meh. Ravager's Mace, 1 black and a red for a pretty much an equipment with no stats, but you give a creature menace, so if you're playing Menace Tribal, something to consider. But you do get a stat boost of +1 for each creature in your party. So, in other words, let's say you attach this to a creature that's already a party member, you'll get the +1 boost. Cool. But if you don't have any members in your party and you attach this to a non party type creature, you're just only getting the menace on it, which, I mean, is fine. It's not great, it's fine. And it also has the equip cost of 2 and Rakdos, which that's pretty costly if you're not doing the party-based mechanics. I don't know. Maybe. I mean, the factor is we do have Nahiri in the format, so you could do Mardu shenanigans, and we know that the token you make is a core warrior, so you are still going to get the minor boost. Plus, with the Nahiri +1, you can attach it to it, so maybe in a fringe like Mardu deck of sorts that do the equipment matter synergies that I've been contemplating on. Maybe. But I highly, highly doubt it. I'm not really impressed by this card, if I'm being honest. Next up, we got Deadly Alliance. 4 and a black. Actually, this card I'm actually a little bit impressed by, believe it or not. This is a card that is destroy target creature or planeswalker, and it costs 1 less for each creature in your party. So this could, if you do go full on to the party-based mechanic, can actually be just a 1 mana destroy target creature or planeswalker, which is pretty powerful. Here's the thing. The reason why I actually like this card a lot more, like, first of all, great limited card. It is going to just be your auto-include limited unconditional removal. But I think this also has some fringe constructed play. And the reason why I'm saying that is because if people are going to try to do the party-based mechanics, like I said, looking at this from incrementally, yeah, it's the best case mentality. This becomes a 1 mana unconditional instant speed kill spell for both creature and planeswalkers. That's great. But even if we look at it from an incremental perspective, 5 mana, yeah, you really not want to cast it for 5 mana, but if you have to, you will. But however, if you do go into the party-based mechanic, you at least need 1 member of your creature, you need 1 member of your party to make this just a decent spell. Like, granted, 4 mana unconditional removal spells we mostly want to have an exile effect, but we will play a 4-mana kill spell if we need to. And then the fact is, when you get a second member, then it becomes a 3-mana unconditional kill spell, which doesn't make you lose life. I wouldn't say it's like as great as Murderous Rider per se, but still something to keep in mind, especially since it's a splash of black rather than having to play the 2 black pips. But you do lose the creep zombie knight that you get from Murderous Rider, so that's something to keep in mind. But still, with 2 members, then it becomes free. And then when it gets lower, then it just becomes really great. Like a 2-mana do this effect, really good. Then of course, like we said before, if you have your full party, this being a 1-mana kill anything, really good. So the factor that at its worst, it's something that you don't mind playing when you need to. To, at the very least, if you have 1 member in your party, it's actually decent. To then being really good. I think this is a card that's actually really decent if you are going to make a budget party deck. And I think this is definitely one for budget decks to keep in mind and constructed, because this is actually a pretty fine card if you do the whole party-based gimmick mechanic. No, seriously, this card is actually a lot better than people will probably take it for granted at first glance, so keep an eye on it. Okay, we're going to skip through the cards we already talked about. These are just the 4 promos of these. Okay, we're now going to get to Alcombe Hellhound. A 1 red mana 0/1 elemental dog, so a 1-mana doggo. Yay! This is the person that's still trying to make pack leader shenanigans and things, so I'm happy to see a 1-mana doggo. And then has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, this gets +2/+2 until end of turn. That's really, 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 really good. Yeah, I think this card is actually a really great common. This aggressive effect is nothing to underestimate, especially in Eternal formats that have like fetch lands and such. So if you want to make like a modern dog tribal deck, this is actually a great 1-drop for it, just beyond the very aggressive. And also in standard, this is going to be really good because then you have Pack Leader to give the +1/+1 boost, so then it's a 1-mana 1/2. And if you attack with Pack Leader, then this will not be dealt damage to it, or the combat damage will be prevented. So if you play like a land and such, then it will get big. It's just, I like this card's shtick. I like that it's a nice budget option for dog decks. I do think it's a good doggo. I like this card, and I do like the fact that the showcase art on it is actually, well, still horrifying to some extent, but also is really pretty. It's like horrifyingly pretty. I think is the best way I'm going to phrase that. Okay, a card that I was wanting to talk about, but Scryfall didn't have it up, but it was previewed yesterday. Drana, the Last Blood Chief. 5 mana for a 4/4 legendary creature vampire cleric with flying. When this attacks, defending player chooses a non-legendary creature card in your graveyard. So it's in your graveyard, not any other player's graveyard, your graveyard. And then once they choose it, you return that card to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. That creature is a vampire in addition to its other types. I think this is good, but I don't think it's great. I think if you're trying to do kind of like graveyard shenanigans and you need like a late game threat that could be a 5-mana 4/4 flyer, here you go. The fact that doesn't have haste is kind of costly though, but if we do have ways to give our creatures haste, then maybe I would consider this card a little bit more, because then you can give this haste and then attack in as soon as it enters the battlefield. This is a card that would actually been a lot nice if it had flash, actually, because just like I said, it would be better that at least if you can get that trigger off once. If you can get that trigger off once, then you're perfectly fine with it, because then you can return maybe one of your powerful early game to late game creatures. Well, maybe not late game. Your opponent's going to choose the creature that they think is going to be a good choice. So they're going to choose the worst, so to speak. But maybe you can play this in like a Gagari deck, and then you have Scavenging Ooze, and you just eat the cards you don't really want to reanimate with Drana the Last Blood Chief. Kind of like trim your graveyard in a sense. So then once you attack with Drana, then they will have to choose, unfortunately, the threat that you wanted to reanimate. Plus the fact that it becomes a vampire with +1/+1 counter will make it hard to remove with Heartless Act and such. But on the other side of the coin, this can also be targeted with Heartless Act. So I like the card. I'm not sure about the standard playability. I do think this is going to be a fun Brawl card, though. Or at least in a card in the main deck of a Brawl deck. But standard, we're going to have to wait and see. I don't think so, but I do like the card overall. Plus, also, if you're playing Vampire Tribal and EDH, well, here's another vampire to add to the mix. Actually, it's pretty good vampire and vampire tribal decks in EDH, actually, the more I think about it. Okay, cards we talked about, cards we talked about. Okay, here's one we didn't talk about. Finally, I got another goblin to actually sneak out with Conspicuous Snoop. Grotag Bugcatcher, 1 in a red for a Goblin Warrior. It has trample, it's a 1-2, and when it attacks, it gets +1 until end of turn for each creature in your party. So since this is a warrior, it's going to attack as a 2-2 with trample. I think this card is actually secretly a little bit good, believe it or not. Especially if you are trying to do the goblin based party deck. This is actually a really fine 2-drop for the goblin party deck because, at worst, it's a 2-2 with trample, which, if you're playing like combat tricks or stuff like that, a 2-2 with trample will pretty much help against majority of chump blockers in the format, like a bunch of 1-1s and such. They are going to have a hard time attacking into a 2-2 with trample. Plus, we do also have trample payoffs in the format, such as like the 1 Quartzwood Crasher, which then can make a token, which, granted, I guess if their opponent's like blocking with a 1-1, then you just get a 1-1 trample token, which, okay, it's a 1-1 token, but then the fact that this can be buffed if you have party members, then it becomes significant with the Quartzwood Crasher combo. Also, there is the factor that in these type of decks, you might be running equipment, so this can actually get buffed pretty quick. So I actually like this common a lot more than I probably should, realistically, but I'm actually going to keep an eye on it, especially since one of the first early access decks is going to make the Goblin Party deck. So yeah, this is going right in that deck. I don't know if it's going to be like a deck you're going to see at like a Pro Tour or anything. I don't think it's going to be a card you're going to see in competitive rank play, but for casual rank play even, I think it's perfectly fine. Next up, Zooport Duelist, another flashy rogue. Great. And then when it enters the battlefield, target creature gets -2 until in a turn, and Miller controls 2 cards. Actually, I think this is pretty good. This is a nice rogue. Essentially, being able to flash and then be used as a semi-combat trick is perfectly nice. Plus, the fact that it mills the cards is also nice, which then goes into that blue-black mill deck kind of scenario. So, yeah, I think this is a pretty fine common. I don't know if it's like going to see proper play, but I think as a budget option in the blue black rogue list, it's actually a pretty good card. So yeah, keep an eye on it. Okay, let me see if there's anything else. There's Expedition Diver, which is actually honestly just a really decent limited card, but I don't think it's going to be much constructed playable. Yes, the fact that if you control another wizard when this dies, it draws a card is cool, but I think it's more of a limited application card than a constructed application card. Okay, we talked about this, we talked about this. We haven't talked about Prowling Felidar, which, I like the card because the factor is with landfall, this can get big really quick, especially if you have multiple ways to put lands on the battlefield. That being said, I do think this is more just a limited card, but in a counter-space deck, you might try it out just for fun, but I think it's more a limited card, though the art on that, the promo art is gorgeous. And also the regular art is kind of hilarious, especially with the flavor text. Like, read the flavor text here. On occasion, Felidars leave meaty gifts outside the tents of explorers they considered worthy. That is hilarious. It's kind of like the cat leaving a mouse by your gift mouse and such. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about... forgive me if I butcher this name. Sajiri Shelter, as well as Sajiri Glacier. Which, honestly, I think this card is really good of this kind of a cycle, a spell / land. Because this type of spell you normally would play in a